Let's start.
Thank you.
Okay. We're a very intimate group, so and everybody knows Bülent.
Exactly.
So we don't need long introductions. The topic is very interesting. It deserves much larger audience, and I don't know if we perhaps need to repeat that at some point next year. Because developments in Turkey will continue to preoccupy us as a big country. And this topic, Turkey within global context, right-wing populism, the era of global shift, it connects with Bülent's work on Turkey and his understanding of Turkish politics as a contest between two neoliberal projects. In fact, and this is very, very fascinating. You all know Bülent is a professor at Kiel, doesn't need long introductions, so you can go Bülent straight to your presentation.
Thank you.
Which I hope will become an article.
So we have several weeks passed after the latest elections in Turkey, and before and during the elections, so many people got excited because they thought there was an alternative, there was a left-wing alternative. But when we looked at the program of the opposition bloc, especially their economics program and the policies, I cannot see a real alternative. And this, the following half an hour or so, I'm going to show that there was no real alternative, and because of this, the result doesn't represent a victory for the ruling party, but a failure of the opposition, or failure of not presenting a real alternative to the current problems of Turkey. So this is the main thing. So it is in a way the bankruptcy, political bankruptcy of the main opposition party, CHP, and its leader, Kılıçdaroğlu, and his alliance with the right-wing forces in Turkey. Kılıçdaroğlu adopted a broadly pro-Western, anti-Russian, and very clearly pro-NATO line as well in terms of politics, international politics, and ignored the significance of the consequence of this pro-Western line. He kept mostly silent on the Kurdish issue, and he appealed to the fascistic forces, especially before the second round, and he declared an open war against refugees. And as we know, the overwhelming majority of those mainly Syrian refugees, they live in deep poverty, very difficult conditions, without any basic rights, and he deliberately targeted this group of people, and in a way, politically as well, he presented a very right-wing platform. So the election has not resolved any issues, any critical problems faced with Turkey, and re-election of Erdogan in the second round against Kılıçdaroğlu to me is a political experience for all international socialists, all those campaigning for a more democratic and socialist conditions. So in a way, this election was about Turkey, but the international significance of this campaign and the result is quite significant. Recep Tayyip Erdogan won more than 52% in the second round, and Kılıçdaroğlu received just below 48%, and the difference in votes over 2 million, 2.3 or 2.4 million. Erdogan was ahead in and Erdogan was ahead in 52 provinces of Turkey. Kılıçdaroğlu was in 29 provinces. Kılıçdaroğlu increased his vote in Turkey's three largest cities, Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir. And Kılıçdaroğlu also came first in the Asian and Mediterranean coast, and most of the Kurdish majority areas. So it shows that the Kurdish people voted for the opposition, even though the opposition's platform wasn't for Kurdish rights openly. So Erdogan, during the campaign, resorted to a false anti-imperialist populist line, and he tried to stop his declining popularity because of the problems of Turkey. And he obviously took advantage of his rivals, his opponents, very clearly pro-NATO, pro-Western line. Kılıçdaroğlu had pledged during the election campaign to bring Turkey even deeper, closer into NATO's war with Russia. He even accused the Russian government openly of interfering in the elections, trying to affect the election results. It happened before the first round, and when he was doing this, he didn't provide any evidence whatsoever, and nobody else provided any evidence, and even some of his own members of the party was surprised and even shocked with this open accusation of a foreign government, which was very anti-diplomatic as well. So in terms of economy, Kılıçdaroğlu adopted a very clear, very open pro-Western economic program. He pledged to develop close ties with Western financial circles, mainly in London and New York, and proposed adopting a very closely IMF-led anti-worker austerity program. His economic advisors were talking about tightening the belts and introducing austerity in order to stop rising inflation. After the first round, Kılıçdaroğlu signed an election protocol agreement with the far-right, almost racist and fascist Victory Party, Zafer Party. And on the basis of that, as I mentioned, he built his campaign, the most outspoken part of his campaign, against those innocent Syrian refugees. So many of the pollsters, both in Turkey and abroad, before the elections, they were expecting AKP would lose. And this was the general climate among the urban population of Turkey as well. But however, as we know, they were all wrong. Now AKP, MHP hold more than 320 seats out of 600 in the parliament. Even though Kılıçdaroğlu received more presidential votes than those previous challengers to Erdogan, his party failed to materialize expectations, securing only 25%, in contrast to the 30% it received in the 2019 local elections. So CHP vote declined in that sense from 2019. The opposition was confident, as I said, all during the campaign, and even during the night of the election, some of the key figures like İmamoğlu or Mansur Yavaş, they kept telling in their own pro-opposition TV channels, we won, we are definitely going to come into power. Again, it was at the very early stages of the election, but they created such a false impression that when the actual results came, there was almost a quiet shock and silence all over. And their followers, this created a huge decline of morale. So most polls and analysts were expecting defeat of the AKP, mainly because of the economic situation in Turkey. Like the Turkish lira lost a huge amount of value. since late 2022. And the cost of living crisis was huge in Turkey, was very serious. So because of this, again, even the Western observers were expecting that a party in power for 21 years and causing or being seen responsible for this huge economic problems, then they were expecting they will definitely lose. But of course, as we know, instead the exact opposite happened. Turkey's almighty president, Erdogan, extended his rule into a third decade. Even in the cities where earthquake caused high level of damage, and AKP and Erdogan were accused of being really late in supporting those people who suffered as a result of earthquake. Even in those cities, AKP and Erdogan got significantly high level of vote. So the government, in that sense, was not punished, either economically or politically. So what is the explanation for this? This is the rest of my talk is about this, why this happened like this. There are obvious reasons for the resilience of Erdogan and Erdogan's regime. He has spent years monopolizing the judiciary, law enforcement, and rule by executive power. And as a result of this, he has ensured the state apparatus become completely loyal to him. He controlled almost everything. He has controlled almost everything in terms of Turkish state. He has overseen the construction of a media environment that is overwhelmingly loyal and compliant to AKP as well. He put thousands of activists, journalists, politicians in prison. However, his heavy authoritarian control is not enough to explain the election results. AKP regime's perseverance is not simply a result of heavy oppression. The actual reasons for its still continuing popularity among more than half of Turkish population run much deeper. There are much more deeper economic and political and social reasons for this. There are several structural and historical reasons, factors for this. Before the elections, most opposition politicians refused to recognize, even to understand these reasons, and that was at the root of their failure to present a proper alternative. So even now, several weeks after the election results, they are still not capable, they seem to be not capable to analyze, to understand these factors. They were concentrating on individuals. If so-and-so were the candidate instead of Kılıçdaroğlu, they were mainly focusing on other things rather than actual, real, structural reasons. So here I will provide a few thoughts that can help us better understand the electoral behavior of Turkey's citizens. And once you look at these factors, I hope the electoral behavior of those citizens won't seem as irrational as it may seem first. Again, this was another of the aspects since the election results. Some opponents of the regime, they keep writing that, oh, because people are ignorant, people are brainwashed, and that's why they vote like this. But I think these are all wrong explanations. First of all, there are serious economic reasons for this result. Since its first election victory in 2002, AKP followed a standard neoliberal economic program with a populist cushion. Because of this, it was possible for the party to keep and even increase its electoral support in the following elections. During the first 5 or 6 years, this was achieved with no difficulty, by the introduction of a new welfare regime with a range of social assistance programs, and also by introducing a financial inclusivity, making consumer loans available to working class people. Supporting such programs in health, education, and housing was only possible when there was a constant inflow of capital into the country. And the economy was growing based on this foreign investment. So in the first 5, 6, 7 years, this was the case, and it was quite easy for AKP to keep this popular support. But after the United States Federal Reserve scaled back its easy money policy alongside an interest rate hike, as a policy response to the 2008 global financial crisis, the inflow of foreign capital first slowed down and then completely stopped. So from 2012-13, the foreign capital inflow almost stopped in Turkey. This put down pressure on Turkish growth. It was then increasingly difficult for the regime, for the government, to continue its populist neoliberalism. The neoliberal economic model still continued in Turkey, but with a much more weakened level of populist cushioning. But still, the regime still was able to manage to keep its support among the working class people by providing a little more, timed carefully, just before the elections. So they started still to provide something to actual working people in Turkey, but timed very carefully just before the elections. So, but after 2011, 2012, Erdogan's regime integrated some state capitalist tools as well. State capitalist tools in order to keep the economy still continuing to grow. So in particular, all these tools were used to help small and medium-sized companies. In Turkish we call them KOBİs, küçük yani orta büyüklükte işletmeler, small and medium-sized companies. So these companies were quite important for the regime. They want these companies to be in business, and large number of people, millions of people working for them to be at employment. This was the key aim of AKP's political, AKP's economic program. So as a result of this, as you can see, the Turkey still continued to export, even though to produce and to export wasn't profitable enough, but the government was keeping the interest rates really low and providing low interest rates credit to these companies. Sometimes they were just selling, and government was covering in the between. For Turkey, in general, it wasn't a profitable business, but what is happening was export continued, and because of the export continued, these companies, 3 million of them, more than 3 million of them, they kept in business. So small and medium-sized companies, there are 3.2 million of them in Turkey, and almost 12 million people work for these companies. So therefore the government wasn't thinking like a capitalist economic unit, because otherwise they would have closed these companies because they were not profitable, but they were thinking how to keep these people's support, how to be popular among this large group of working class people in Turkey. Just imagine 12 million people working and their families, so this is a huge group of people in the whole Turkish population. So because of this, the government lowered interest rates and boosted production. Not because they didn't understand economy. Most of the opposition advisors, economic advisors, they kept saying that, oh, Erdogan doesn't understand economics. Oh, the government is really ignorant of economics. That's why they shouldn't be doing this. But they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. They were doing this deliberately. Because if they increased the interest rates, it would have created huge difficulty for these companies. Just imagine half of this 3.2 million companies going out of business, and there will be a significant increase in unemployment. This would have created so much bigger problems for the government. And they concentrate especially in low tech sectors like construction and textile. So all these thousands and thousands of small and medium-sized companies remained in business, even in those economically difficult, almost like uneconomical times. So these measures, as I said, alienated orthodox mainstream economists and the IMF, because IMF didn't want this happen, and also professional middle classes living in big cities. As a result of increased inflation and low value of Turkish lira, the income of the middle classes declined, and they were really unhappy as a result of this. But this difficult economic conditions didn't affect the working class in the same way. Even though the value of the money declined and everybody's real incomes declining, but because of the increased number of small and medium-sized companies remained in business and new job opportunities opened, and from every working class household, now more than one person started to work. So as a whole, at the end, more people earning from one family, previously just one person working, and therefore the total money entering the family house, working class household, was still significant. I mean, not much, but still sufficient enough for them to feel satisfied. And they were grateful that they had at least jobs and regular income. So this was the main concern for the government, and they succeeded this. So as high inflation and cost of living crisis reduced the real incomes, as I said, I mean, for the professional middle classes, it wasn't possible more people, because they were already husband and wife, both educated, both are professional engineers, doctors, teachers, they both working anyway. So they couldn't have an extra person to go and find job to fill the gap in their reduced income. But for the working class families, and especially in those Anatolian towns, it was possible. This was the difference between people living, middle class people living in big towns, and those working class people living in and working in those small and medium-sized companies. So because also the employment expanded. I will try to show you that slide as well. Between 2019 and now, the number of employment increased in Turkey as a result of this low interest rate policy of the government. So they really knew what they were doing. They really knew what they were doing. Who didn't know what was happening was the opposition and the mainstream economists. They didn't realize. They thought the government is just stupid. They don't understand the economics. And they keep repeating the same lie. So during the election campaign, well, I'm sure you all followed the campaign, and to some extent you all witnessed this. Many people from professional classes, they were complaining about how they find it difficult to go on holidays and how they find it difficult paying their children's private school fees. So this was the main talking aspect during the election campaign. This attitude of the urban middle classes didn't convince, didn't pull together the working classes of Turkey, because they were living in a completely different world. So being fully aware of their own class situation, the working members of the working class in Turkey, they voted for employment. And they voted for who they think would provide them continuous employment. This was their main concern, rather than vague promises coming from the opposition. And as I said, the weakest part of the opposition's program was their economic policy. They kept saying that they have to correct the finance of Turkey by tightening the belts, by some difficult conditions. So they were offering them, well, you are going to even suffer more. So of course this pushed even them further away from them. But they voted for the employment, and they voted for who they think would continue to provide them with employment. So of course, by keeping these companies, uneconomical companies, still in business, in terms of purely capitalist economics sense, doesn't make sense. They were zombie companies. Zombie companies, meaning, I will give you the actual meaning in a minute or so, but this basically means that those companies, they have huge amount of debt, and they borrow and they use this borrowed money to produce and to sell, but they are not able to even pay their debts back. So, and recently, an international survey looked at the zombie companies in the world globally. Turkey comes at the top. So this many companies are zombie companies. But what matters for the government is how to keep these people on our side.
What are the second and third ones?
I think Indonesia, Republic of Ukraine, Russia, Norway, Israel. So as you can see, some of the countries with properly much stronger economies, they have zombie companies too, because this is a calculation. You know, if you are in government, you don't just, as an economic advisor, think how to correct the economy without thinking of the people involved in the economy. You also think at the same time, what will be the consequence for the people now? Will it create unemployment? Will it cause these companies to bankrupt? Then there will be bigger problems for you to deal with. But Turkey, especially because of the elections, they knew elections coming this year, and since 2018-19, they were getting ready for these elections. They said they knew that they couldn't afford these companies to go out of business. They knew that they couldn't afford this many people to go out of employment. Then they wouldn't be able to win the election. So, now, if you look at this graph, there is a positive correlation. There is a positive correlation between number of employments available and the votes for ruling AKP government. As you can see, from the first time they came to power, the employment increased, and even the last few years it started to increase again. Therefore, AKP government's brains, they understood this link very well. They thought, if we provide employment, we will stay in power. And this worked. Especially important for these elections, when there was significant cost of living crisis, everything getting more expensive. So Erdogan's vote, comparing with previous elections, let's say 2018 elections, declined only 3%, which is amazing for a party more than 20 years in power and in this deep economically negative situation. And one can see this trend everywhere. If you look at the individual locations in Turkey, where the majority of the population is working class, we can see the decline of AKP's vote is much less than the national average. For instance, in working class districts of Istanbul, like Bağcılar, Zeytinburnu, Sultan Gazi, Güngören, the level of decline in Erdogan's vote was much smaller than the national average, and much higher in the middle class districts like Kadıköy, Beşiktaş, or Çekmeköy. So basically, Turkey, the classes even like differentiated, like working class people voted for the ruling party, majority of them, and middle class people voted for the opposition. And apart from this, throughout his rule since 2002, Erdogan has always won by large majorities in Anatolian towns, in many small towns, and often did poorly in the large cities, especially in the West. This election was not any different. In all these Anatolian towns, where there is fast industrialization and employment, the decline in Erdogan's vote was much smaller. Therefore, one can conclude that the economic policy of Erdogan, keeping interest rates low and continuing production for export, and therefore keeping those zombie companies in business and those millions of people in employment at the cost of inflation and living crisis, still work for him. So majority of those workers are employed in those COBIs, small and medium-sized companies. The definition of small and medium-sized companies is those companies employing 50 or less people. So as I showed earlier, there were 3.2 million of those companies in Turkey, and almost 12 million people employed for these companies. And the owners of these companies, as you know, from the very beginning of AKP regime, they are natural allies of the Islamic movement. They are so-called Anatolian tigers. This is what they were analyzed, presented in various places. And their workers, approximately 12 million people, voted for Erdogan in large numbers. Despite the high inflation, despite the cost of living crisis, simply because they thought this is the regime which will secure continuing employment for them. So by using some of the welfare schemes and keeping COBIs in business, Erdogan's regime integrated state capitalist tools into its neoliberal program in the second part of AKP regime after 2011-12. So this mixture has kept Turkey on an unconventional but still somewhat sustainable growth path. So this was the economic side. Now the social side is important as well. One of the most important aspects of the AKP's strength in Turkey is socio-political, social and political. And it is about its mass organization. AKP is a mass party, mass organized party. Probably the largest membership party in the whole Europe, with 11 million active members. 11 million. And AKP also has so many local branches, controls a multitude of organizations, civic organizations, charities, professional syndicates, youth clubs, unions, and at the same time, tens of thousands of religious support groups around the mosques. So all these organizations and the members of the organizations give its supporters a sense of power, visibility, and often material perks, material benefits, easy access to jobs and funds. All of these are so important, especially in the times of economic hardship. A sociology professor in Berkeley, Cihan Tual, did some field work in Turkey and Egypt, looking at the supporters of Islamic movements and looking at these kind of local civic organizations. He writes in his books, Cihan Tual, that through local support organizations, these movements have been organizing a large mass of people and providing them a new identity. So hundreds of thousands of people are involved, some as organizers, many as volunteers, and as a result of this, a different kind of Islamist activist is being created. In Turkey, around such AKP-led organizations, local community groups, Quran reading groups, charity groups, and mosque groups, the Islamists are organizing millions of people, providing them material help to poor households, finding employment to hundreds and thousands of people. So this is very important to understand the significance of this AKP organization among the people of Turkey. So not just by saying that these people are being tricked or brainwashed or they were just indoctrinated by Islamists, you cannot achieve anything. You need to create alternative organizations. You need to create alternative grassroots movements. There is no other way, there is no shortcut. The network of working class people organized by Islamists is a reality in Turkey. This tightly organized large community is active for millions of people in Turkey. If you want to win these people, you have to go to these people, where they live, where they work, and you have to create similar alternatives, helping them, solving their day-to-day problems, helping them to find jobs, helping them to educate themselves. And currently, or the last 20, 30 years, nobody is doing this from the left or even from the liberal social democratic side. So by staying in the Western big cities and just talking, you cannot achieve anything. So, yeah, these are economic and socio-political origins of this election result. According to a number of political scientists and sociologists, sociology is very important to understand the situation, in the second decade of the AKP regime, Turkey has shifted from a tutelary democracy to a competitive authoritarianism in Turkey. This is how some sociologists and political scientists explain this. These studies highlight the catalyst role played by the election of populist leaders for the rise of competitive authoritarianism. These are kind of hybrid regimes where democratic institutions are still considered as the principal means of obtaining and exercising power, like elections. But those in power, when they come to power, they abuse them so often and to such extent that electoral competition is anything but fair. According to some authors looking at these regimes, including Turkey, there were 35 competitive authoritarian regimes in the world in 2010. Okay, 2010 there were 35 similar regimes.
Can you name some of them?
I will in a minute. This is the main book written by Levitsky and Wey. It's about competitive authoritarianism, hybrid regimes after the Cold War.
Sorry, Levitsky.
Levitsky.
Levitsky.
So the authors, in 2020, 10 years after they wrote this book, they revisited the original thesis again and they pointed out, they emphasized that the situation is getting even worse. And they said one of the reasons of this, the decline of Western liberal hegemony, so the Western liberal system established after the Cold War is declining, and there is a new form of authoritarianism in a number of countries, such as Hungary, Philippines, Turkey, are increasing. And in a number of other countries, even European countries, the parties or individuals are forcing themselves into the central politics, like Italy, for instance, or even in some of the Scandinavian countries, traditional countries. So before 2020, it was clear that the so-called liberal international order was already in deep trouble. The tectonic plates that underpin this so-called Western liberal order are shifting, and little can be done to stop or to repair this. The fall of Western liberal international order obviously horrifies the Western elites because they built it and they also benefited from the system significantly. According to these authors like Levitsky and May, in 2020, more countries are emerging in this category. What makes these countries separate? What makes these countries separate than the traditional authoritarian countries? Because these countries still have stronger democratic traditions and institutions historically from very early times, and therefore it is not like establishing a military dictatorship like Portuguese or Spanish or Greek or similar Latin American dictatorship. So the authoritarian regimes come to power but still respect and use the institutions and electoral system heavily, tilting the playing field in countries like Turkey, Philippines, Hungary, requires greater skills for these individuals, parties, more sophisticated strategies, and far more extensive popular mobilization. This is so important. They need popular mobilization than, let's say, Madagascar or Moldova. Because those authors looking at these countries, they say this. Prospective autocrats like Erdogan must first command sizable electoral majorities, and this is often achieved via polarizing populist and ethno-nationalist strategy, sometimes religious nationalist strategy. Erdogan didn't only manage to tilt the playing fields in his favor, he also convinced a large part of the population, including the opposition, that this is the new normal. Erdogan keep changing the rules, but also bringing the rest of the people with them, that they accept these changed rules are the new normal. So he's a mastermind of the game. He adapts to new circumstances, changes his tactics, recruits new players to shore up his support base. So the re-election of Islamist AKP and its leader Erdogan as the president is a political experience of international significance for us to understand not only Turkey, but also what's happening in the world, what's happening globally in the third decade of 21st century. Antonio Gramsci wrote in his prison notebooks that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Gramsci was preoccupied with the breakdown and collapse of the liberal order of the post-First World War period, and trying to explain, to understand the rise to power of Benito Mussolini. For Gramsci, Mussolini was one such morbid symptom of the interregnum period, of interwar period. The term interregnum here was used by Gramsci as a period when one arrangement of hegemony is disappearing, but before the full emergence of another arrangement of hegemony is coming into power. It seems that in the third decade of the 21st century, the world is once again living an interregnum. It is poised between inward-looking old hegemonic powers, the United States and European states, and reluctant new emerging powers, China and other emerging economies. Developments such as razor fences covering Eastern Europe's borders against North African and Middle Eastern migrants, militant Hindu nationalism abandoning secularism in Narendra Modi's India, right-wing populist mavericks like Duterte and Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines, and Orban's right-wing authoritarian populism in Hungary are among the many morbid symptoms of our period, of our time. So is Trump's still powerful isolationism, America First position, which is supported by Christian evangelicals, not only in America, but in other countries too. So it was therefore not just a coincidence that Erdogan's regime in Turkey turned increasingly authoritarian during the same period. All of these right-wing populist leaders, from Hungary to India, from Italy to Philippines, and from Turkey to Thailand, are alike, are similar in specializing in aggressive patriotism, extremist religious ideas, and specializing in the defense of endangered national independence and nostalgia for past glories. Consequently, in several countries, including Turkey, Hungary, Egypt, Philippines, and we can include many more nowadays, we are witnessing increasingly repressive state apparatus. Of course, in all these countries, in every single one of them, when we talk to a Turkish person or an Egyptian person, they of course are concerned about their local conditions, and they give us lots of reasons from that locality. Of course, we understand this. There are local and national cultural conditions in each case to prepare, to contribute these rise of such right-wing authoritarian movements, surges. But this populist authoritarian outbreak, because happening in the same period, in the same time, is not rooted in the personalities or psychologies of these individuals, like Erdogan or Orban, or not rooted in the cultural or religious conditions of these countries, because they are all different from each other. Some Muslim, some Catholic, and some not religious, just nationalistic. But the real roots of this situation is related to underlying conditions and long-term historical factors of the global system, global political and economic system, and the changing balance of power and the emerging interregnum period. One hegemonic system is declining, another one is rising, but nothing settled yet. Trump, Modi, Orban, Erdogan, they are less the creators than the outcome of the protracted economic, social, and political processes. It would be a mistake to think that the so-called liberal order is in trouble simply because Trump's, Erdogan's, Orban's, and many other similar populist autocrats' rhetoric and policies. In fact, more fundamental problems are at play, which account for why these autocrats have been able to successfully challenge and mobilize the established order. So all these populist right-wing shifts are the result of an increasingly volatile and chaotic international situation. This trend has become much more emphasized and clear in the aftermath of 2008 global financial crisis and economic downturn. This is the direct consequence of a process what Giovanni Arrighi called hegemonic transition within a period of systemic chaos. In this transition period, the incumbent hegemonic group lacks the means or the will to continue, to lead, and the emerging ones are not ready yet to replace. So in many parts of the world, not only in emerging economies like Turkey, but also in core economies in many Western countries, new forms of authoritarianism are emerging within the context of global crisis, severe austerity measures, economic nationalism, racism and xenophobia. This new authoritarianism is a morbid symptom in itself and is at the root of other authoritarian and morbid forms that grow from below. So it is obvious, if we come back to Turkey, the current position, the current juncture represents a particularly dismal chapter in Turkish history. It displays all the traits of economic crisis and political exhaustion. The problem is not just the AKP and its leader Erdogan. The opposition bloc's appeal before the election was almost like anyone but Erdogan. This slogan, anyone but Erdogan, sounds clear and straightforward, but it is not only simplistic, it is also misleading, reducing Turkey's deep structural problems to a simple personal one. The problem for Turkey at this critical point is structural and historical. What can be called a polycrisis in the world has dealt an enduring setback to development in emerging economies like Turkey. The economy is dependent on foreign currency and foreign investment. The crisis, it seems, will persist for the foreseeable future. It's not a temporary crisis. The current state of Turkish economy and Turkish politics should be understood in the context of global rise of right-wing authoritarianism. This is itself a consequence of neoliberal restructuring and the global shift. Neoliberal economic governance and right-wing authoritarian leaders and movements are posing serious threats to democratic rights and freedoms all around the world, not only in Turkey. Successful resistance to this toxic mix in one place should start by learning from the experience of other countries that have been similarly damaged, and not by looking at one country's experience in isolation. Full stop.
Thank you so much, Bülent. That was excellent.
Yeah.
So, Bülent, thank you for your excellent presentation. You can now ask questions if you want. I have one or two, but you better start instead of me abusing my role as a. You want to kick off?
Yeah.
Okay. Now look, when the neoliberalism was starting embedding itself in society and economics and everything, it was a very authoritarian project, right? Thatcher here, you know, smashed the working class movement, the trade unions and everything. So it was an authoritarian project. There are also books, theoretical books. Gladden, for example, wrote in the late 70s. It was one of the first who captured this transition from Keynesianism to neoliberal thing, and he called it authoritarian statism at the time. Now, we are now, I believe, and if you want to comment on that, at the end of that neoliberal project, although the project is not going to die if we don't push it to overthrow it, if you see what I mean. And some people, like you said, they call it competitive authoritarianism. Is there any qualitative difference between those two ends of neoliberalism, the beginning and the end? And how can we connect those? If you see what I mean, one in the 70s, for example, and the 80s, obviously, and now we are in 2023, financial crisis, Eurozone mess and crisis, pandemic, war in Ukraine, and things are, I mean, the British state may nationalize the, you read recently, the state here in Britain may nationalize the,
Water?
not the railroad, the water.
Yeah.
The water.
Yes,
I mean,
have to.
look, there are trends towards.
Now, I take Andrew Gamble's definition, my criteria. And remember, Andrew Gamble in that journal you participated.
Yeah.
He says neoliberalism like chameleon. There are so many different versions, varieties of neoliberalism, but in essence, we are still in neoliberal period. But also I want to go back, why neoliberalism? It wasn't like suddenly one morning Friedman woke up and said, oh, I found a new method. It wasn't like that. You know, as we wrote in our books, after the Second World War, the first 2 decades, rate of profit margin was really high. Because they were rebuilding and they were saying the American economy was controlling everywhere, and then there were expansion, employment, but all this can be measured by rate of profit. But then, when the West European countries and Japan recovered from the war damage, and then the United States started to also be damaged economically and politically as a result of the Vietnam War, which lasted much longer, which was costly, and also prestige of the American power started to decline, then all this affected the competition, especially, increased competition. The American companies now had to compete with British, Italian, French, and Japanese companies, and therefore, in order to stay in the market, they had to all reduce the prices. And this made the profit margins smaller and smaller. So when the profit margin starts going down, especially below the interest rates, then the investment stops. And from 1970s onwards, we witnessed a number of small periods of recessions and crises. So in this period, all the managers of the economy and the economic advisors, they were looking for how can we make the rate of profit margin to rise again, because we want the economy to expand. Because those initial 1950s and 60s called golden ages of capitalism. So they all wanted to go back to that golden age of capitalism. They said, how can we do this? But because there is so much competition now, how can you do this? They didn't go and invade new countries. It's not the 19th century imperialism. So no new amazing technological advances came either. So they thought, okay, how can we cut the cost? So if you look at anything, let's say a computer produce, and you want to sell your computer with a high profit margin, but everybody else doing computers, so you have to be in a tight market. So in order to increase your profit margin, the only way you can cut this by cutting the cost going to laborers, the workers, so the wages. That's why the first attack on the trade unions, workers' rights, and then came the flexible working hours, longer working hours, and real income started to decline. So neoliberalism started with this. Neoliberalism came into existence because they wanted to increase the profit margin again, or in Marxist terms, rate of profit. So they managed to increase it a little bit, but they never managed to go back to the 1950s and 60s, because in those periods there was no competition for the American companies. They were putting the price they want on everything. So neoliberalism emerged in that period. But as a result of this, what happened, as we also discussed in the global shift context, when the companies, capitalist companies, they wanted to make largest profit. There is a limit. I mean, even if in England, in France, in America, you can damage the trade unions, you can cut their power, and you can make workers powerless, but still there's a limit. You cannot exploit them below a certain limit. and therefore they started looking around. The capitalist companies, the company making this computer, for instance, they said, okay, if we go to India or China or any other country where the labor cost is much cheaper, and that's why they started shifting the productions to other places. And what happened? The advanced capitalist countries started to lose the production capacity. So the car companies started to move, other companies started to move, and therefore there came a second aspect, one major aspect of neoliberalism, which is financialization. So then the British capitalists or American capitalists, they said, well, we lost the factories, but we still have the banks, we still have the financial market. So therefore they started to use financial means to make profit. So at that point they started to introduce flexible lending conditions. For instance, after 1929-30 Great Depression, a number of measures were introduced in all economies. They don't want banks to encourage speculation. But now in the 1980s and 90s, they started to encourage them to do as much speculation as possible, because this was the only area they can make profit. This was the financial sector remained the only area. Then therefore banks started giving mortgages to everyone, encouraging people using credit cards, and getting more and more debt. So these two aspects, to me, are the key aspects of neoliberalism. Keeping the workers under control, hitting the trade unions, making the flexible working hours, zero-hour contracts, and at the same time encouraging people to use credit to buy houses, even if they cannot afford to do this. So this is financialization, and the other one is fight against trade unions. And I think if we look at now, yes, many things are changing, especially conditions forcing states authorities like Erdogan, for instance. Erdogan introduced state capitalist methods into his neoliberalism. And even here, price controls. A neoliberal economy shouldn't have price control, a pure neoliberal economy. But price controls started to be introduced everywhere now, because of the otherwise local economies will die. Like the water now is going to be nationalized and maybe more, okay? But these, still the essential aspects of the economy, those two aspects are still there. So that's why I still can call it a neoliberal economy, and those other aspects incorporated out of desperation.
Do you mean the small companies as well?
No, yeah, I mean to keep the Kobis in business, that therefore giving them uneconomical support, which is against neoliberalism, for instance, what Erdogan is doing, keeping the interest rates low and low and low, that those companies shouldn't be in trouble.
See, one of the points I think we should discuss is that the trend in the medium developed countries shows us that Western type bourgeois democracy, which we had taken for a long time as absolute, is not an absolute, it's a variable, but capitalism is constant. They do whatever necessary for keeping capitalism alive. It could be Western type bourgeois democracy or Eastern type bourgeois rule, which is happening everywhere, in Indonesia, in Philippines, in Thailand, in Turkey. If you take a whole sort of range of countries, bourgeois democracy in the Western understanding we understand does not exist at all.
It is declining as well. I mean, even in the so-called, in the actual places of bourgeois democracy, like England or United States, you can see the boundaries of the democracy is getting tighter and tighter. I mean, here, for instance, people lost so many rights during the last
Strike rates.
10 years. In many Western countries, this is happening. And even in some European Union member states like Hungary, we are witnessing something similar to Turkey. In Poland, for instance, I mean, in many aspects now, European Union is struggling, is finding it very difficult to keep these countries within the boundaries of European Union's general principles in terms of women's rights, gay rights.
There's a new law here in this United Kingdom about strike laws. New laws make striking even more difficult than already it is.
Everywhere.
Yes. And demonstrations, for instance, because of this stop the oil demonstrations, and they affect the traffic, and they now stop some of the sport exhibitions. They are now introducing new rules. I think they are discussing, and there is a resistance in the parliament, but at the end they will pass it, I know. And they will put long prison sentences for those people. Just go and protest for environment will be a really daring thing, so really critical thing. And even slight things, very peaceful things will become more difficult.
During the Thatcher time, when the economy, labor intensity moved out, all the houses are because mortgage is very important in this country, not like Germany. Men went out to other cities to find a job, and the females stayed at home because they have children. The children are going to the state schools. They can't move really with them. And Americans cleverly come there and they give them the digital things that the countries like Philippines and Taiwan and so on, they were doing it, to the places where not England and Scotland. So Silicon Valley become the name of the Scottish, whatever the Glen Valley or something like that. Yeah, I mean these female, without the husband, become very, they were never trade unionized. So they were much more pliable, and they immediately put the hand on them, and they start to work.
Yes, exactly.
They do seek.
I think this reminds me just related to your question as well, because we have orderly liberalism, which is a version of neoliberalism, but orderly liberalism from the start had state control to some extent. So it wasn't something against neoliberalism. That's why I think I mentioned Andrew Gamble's definition. He says neoliberalism can be applied with a heavy religious coloring, nationalist coloring, and completely non-religious coloring, with democracy, with authoritarianism. So, I mean, neoliberalism started in this world with Pinochet, and in Turkey in a very similar way, because when Turgut Özal January, was it 12th January or something?
November.
No, only 12th of January conditions. Turgut Özal was in power, and he introduced a number of economic restructuring measures, which was typical neoliberal measures. He was a typical Chicago boy type of person. He worked in the IMF before, so he tried to introduce them. So in the Turkish economy. But as a result of this, I remember I was activist in Turkey, and for weeks we campaigned. I mean, everywhere, in every city in Turkey, all the trade unions, all the students, everyone protested, days after days. There was a huge resistance in Turkey, and they couldn't do this. And only then military coup came. And only after military coup, they just in a fast way, introduced all those measures. And the leader of the military coup, Kenan Evren, later, not immediately at that time, but later, he was being interviewed on one of the televisions, and I have the text somewhere, and he said, if we hadn't come to power, if we hadn't intervened, none of the 12 January measures would have been introduced safely in Turkey. We prepared the ground for the economic restructuring. So he knew what he was doing, just like in a very Chilean way. I mean, in Pinochet's Chile, it happened 2 years before, isn't it? In 1973, wasn't it?
73, yeah.
Yeah, 7 years before Turkey happened in Chile, and then in 1980, similar thing happened in Chile. When the coup came, immediately they abolished all the unions. Not only trade unions, even the student unions. They put all those people involved in the unions in prison, abolished all the political parties, and then when they started gradual opening, you realize that everything changed. All the rules, all the conditions, all the legal framework changed, which was very convenient for very harsh neoliberalism.
Let me now tell you something else which connects perfectly with the term of populism. In Greece at the time, in 1981, you had the Socialist Party in government for the first time since the Civil War. And that Socialist Party, contrary to all the trends in Europe and the world, which was neoliberal, they started for the first time implementing some socialist measures, like building a welfare state, giving high wages, typical Keynesian pro-demand-led policies, right, against supply side.
Yeah.
And then the neoliberal, call it left, call it right, whatever, also within his own party, started calling him populist. Why? Because he says this is not conducive to development, to growth. Whereas neoliberalism is growth. So you are anti-growth, so therefore you are a populist. So all this debate on populism, which goes until 1996, till he died, they were calling him populist in a negative way, because he resisted neoliberalism in Greece.
Yes.
It's amazing. So, you know, when I see that, I was fiercely anti-socialist because I was a member of the Communist Party at the time, and I was criticized by Panera. When I came here and I went to pay for a ticket, my first experience here, the second day in Britain, 1992, I went to pay a ticket, and I realized that the ticket is more expensive before 9 a.m. Whereas in Greece, Papandreou, before 8 a.m., nobody was paying any ticket to travel, because who travels there? The workers. I could not understand that. It was the other way around here. I said, is that progress? Is that, you know? And I started rethinking, reappreciating all that he's done, alone against anybody in Europe. Because Mitterrand was defeated in 1983, remember? Mitterrand was defeated.
Yes.
Only perhaps the Scandinavian countries were a bit socialist at the time. Was the only one who was going to Europe where he had to face Thatcher in groups and so on. He resisted till he died, you know, to monetarism. And I appreciate it a lot. I mean, I'm thinking
I think that's a very good example of Tina in Greek standard. There is no alternative. This is what Margaret Thatcher and Reagan introduced and convinced everyone. I mean, even the so-called socialists started talking the same language. I mean, just like Erdogan does in Turkey, but globally they convince everyone that if you want to progress economically, you have to follow. This is the only route. There is no other way.
Yeah. And imagine Greece is a small place. You know, if big countries start resisting the neoliberal tide, it will be so much better.
I clearly remember those days. Poll tax, yes.
Poll tax?
I resisted, I didn't pay, I went to court. It was dreadful actually, what sort of is robbing people with the tax. And also, various things I remember that it was absolutely horrid to resist, for example, miners' strike. for two years or something. It was very strong, and people all around. What else? All these more countries lost jobs completely, and the whole structure changed upside down. And its effect on the children, effects on the women, effects on the male workers are very different.
Yeah.
I have some points to make. We talked quite a lot about SMEs, COBIs. Now, if you could explain what the weight of COBIs within the Turkish economy and within the exports, total exports, and the role of the multinational Turkish companies or big Turkish companies, the weight of their export within the total export.
It is here, isn't it?
Yeah. And the second
Oh,
question.
because it is in Turkish, I can explain it.
Second.
I have
Second-
data on that. I have data connected because of the book.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Also, second question is that the last picture you had there. What is to be done under the given circumstances if Western bourgeois democracy is a variable? It is not absolute in today's Turkey anyway. What is to be done for the working classes, working people? What should they do? We should discuss.
I have answered to that as well.
Yeah.
Well,
I think the copy is here because it is Turkish. I didn't realize the 5.8 trillion, and this is 64.5% of the total revenues or companies in Turkey. So COBI is considered almost like two-thirds of all the Turkish production revenues or sale revenues, and their share in the total export is 56.3%. So it is quite significant. And remember, in the early days of AKP, in 2003, 2004, so many people in the West, they looked at and tried to understand and analyze AKP's came to power and where was the economic base. And they were talking about so-called Anatolian tigers. They were considering them similar to South Korean or Taiwan or Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, those kind of companies. And these are the companies which AKP from the start had the actual base, support base. The owners of like around 3 million people, like the owners of these companies, small and medium-sized company owners, they are the actual Islamist bourgeoisie. They were, but of course during the last 20 years they created much bigger bourgeoisies as well because of AKP provided them support, and some of them became big holdings. There are several holdings, and AKP's economic policy also pushed those others which didn't collaborate with the government, but some of the major capitalist holdings remained in power because at the end of the day they don't care whether it is AKP or VAKFI, as long as they were allowed to operate, like Koç Holding, for instance. I mean, I think I sent to you, but I didn't include here. They are talking about serious economic problems since 2018 at least in Turkey. But this period, 2018 to 2023, this 5 years, Koç Holding increased its profit more than any other previous periods.
10 times.
Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Just because the big holdings have the monopolies in the areas. For instance, Koç Holding can determine the prices of their items. They are so big, they have monopolies. So therefore, some people calculated recently whether this inflation is the natural result of the economic conditions. or natural result of workers' wages, or because AKP also increased some of the workers' wages, not in real term, because of the inflation, it declined again, but some economists, some social economists, they calculated the real reason of this inflation is the big holdings monopoly situation. They have the monopolies and they put the prices. They didn't need to increase prices like that because they calculate everything. Let's say Koç Holding sells, let's say, fridges, okay? So they say, okay, what is the raw material? And they look at raw material prices and the increase in raw material prices and the energy prices. They put everything. They said, well, the actual increase should be 12%. But Koç Holding increased this 30%. In many categories, big holdings decided to increase their prices much more than the actual natural increase. Yeah, I wish I would put that here.
Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, from 2019 to 2023, it becomes more than twice the Koç Holding's profit margin or rate of profit. And those people, those economists who did these calculations, they included all the expenses within this chart. So they didn't ignore the Ukrainian war, they didn't ignore the COVID, external. They included everything. They said, okay, Ukrainian war affected the energy prices. They said, okay, the COVID affected all those items coming from other places. They become much more difficult and much more expensive. They put them on the chart. Still, the Koç Holding should have increased its prices maybe 10 or 12%, not 30%. And Sabancı exactly the same. They did a number of holdings and all these major holdings in Turkey because they have the monopolies in the area. They can do this. And unless government intervenes and makes price controls, and government didn't do this because government and them, even though at the surface they are TÜSİAD, and TÜSİAD is apart from Islamic capital, but in actual reality, no. The government didn't damage their interest, their profit. Which you were asking me about TÜSİAD, MÜSİAD competition. Well, that competition isn't the real competition. Because when we look at those holdings, not all of them, not even many of them are members of MÜSİAD.
Is also the copies are working for the monopolies?
Yes, because let's say copies are not, most of the copies are not making the final products. They are making one part for a big company,
yeah.
bigger company. So copies are getting small profits,
yeah.
And then the actual company which makes the final fridge or computer, they decide the final profit margin. And when they do this, they were very greedy. Actually, that greed is the actual reason of the inflation. Not only in Turkey. The other day I was watching an interview with John McDonnell, and as you know, John McDonnell understands economy really well. He was saying exactly the same thing for here, saying that the reason for the inflation is not the prices of the workers, because we didn't increase the price of the workers, just the opposite. The price of the workers in actual value going down, but then why the inflation? It's not because of the Ukrainian war, it's not because of the COVID, because the major big holdings, because of their monopoly situation, they are too greedy. They use this situation. This difficult period is a good period for them.
In Spain, when they introduced, they put a cap on prices, inflation is 1.9%.
Exactly. So this is what John McDonnell was saying. They're saying that if you want to control inflation, you don't need to increase the interest rates as Bank of England is doing. You need to do price control. You need to do price control, and you need to make sure that essential items for the majority of the population using, their prices will not increase astronomically. And this is happening in many countries in Europe. I was telling before the meeting to Ismail and Mümin, in France, I think late last year, maybe around Christmas, the government had a meeting with all the major big supermarket holdings, and the government, I think, offered them something like those items you import for your supermarkets, we will limit the tax we get from you, and in return we want you to put price control over essential items like bread, milk, and all other food items, and therefore inflation is not increasing that much. This is the only way to control inflation, not to play with the interest rates.
So this is the fault of the government not able to
Exactly.
regulate them.
Because some governments are very neoliberal, they are in bed with the big holdings, the big capital. Yeah. Look, those companies, those 15 companies increased their profit. Wow. Koç Holding increased their profit just in 1 year, 1,100%. And followed by İş Bankası, again almost 1,000%. Then Akbank, Garanti Bankası, Yapı Kredi, Tüpraş, Vakıflar Bankası, Şişe Cam, glass making, Ford Otosan, and all those banks and auto companies. So look, the percentage is so amazing. It is not even 100%. It is the lowest one is 500%, and then going up to over 1,000% in 1 year. And everybody is struggling in this year. This is a very difficult period for the majority of the people, and these holdings and their shareholders are having the time of their dream.
Yeah, do you remember that at that period of time when the neoliberal economy started in Britain, there was a movement, it's called The Small is Beautiful.
Yes, I know.
Schumacher was a book.
Of course, yeah. Schumpeter, isn't it?
Schumacher
Schumacher,
wrote
yeah.
that book, Small
yes.
is Beautiful.
Yes.
It was Schumacher, then disappeared, I don't know what happened. It was a book.
So the copy is basically the rescue operation in a way. Number one, social unrest is stopped in a way that you give something to the poor person to be looking after their family. And also it looks like this amount, I mean, when we look at the numbers and the percentages, those people are working, basically, not unemployed. And plus, the monopolies are making extreme profit by utilizing the labor of the small companies. When I was working in the London Borough of Oslo, we were very keen on supporting the small and medium companies. I remember making big meetings, inviting 90 of the companies to come together and really mingle and bring out their wishes, what they need from the local government. And also Europe and part of the central government give the large sum of money for me to develop a project in the Hansel area. Regional minority communities needs to know that there opportunities exist for them to set up the small and medium companies. So at that point of time, I never thought about politically that why this interest with the Europe, actually, European Union. European Union and the local governments are working together on those projects.
We didn't talk about this one. This shows the poverty rate significantly declined in the first 10 years or so, until 2012. And then it started to increase, but the government, again, as I said, just before the election period, they were splashing money, and which is affecting, as you can see this. And in 2020, I mean, they couldn't do this. They did a little bit, but they mainly concentrated on keeping people in employment. And many working class families, they thought this was at least secure for us. And just also simply because opposition bloc never managed to provide a convincing alternative. I mean, the alternative, they keep saying that Babajan was talking in terms of economy as the spokesperson of the opposition. He kept saying that, oh, we have to tighten the belt. We have to tighten the belt. We have to do austerity, and then we will sort out. Maybe we will have some difficult period, but then we will come to settle. And people already were suffering and struggling. They were thinking, how more difficult can it be? Because everything they were saying, we will increase the interest rates suddenly. And when that happened, everybody understands that suddenly so many companies will go out of business, and suddenly hundreds and thousands of people become unemployed. Even if you believe that that is the right thing to do, you wouldn't just tell this just like that. So they basically, they didn't first of all understand why those people supported the government, and secondly, they didn't, almost like they didn't care about them. They were talking to middle class audience all the time.
So, the last question then about this, what you mentioned, Tusiadum, there is another one as well, several others, Tucson
emerged as during the Gülen
period, which now is not in the good books of Erdogan, right? But my readings recently on Turkey, because you know I work on this topic of sub-imperialism, is that companies like Koç, Sabancı, another one, Excavasi, Anadolu, these are very big transnational capital companies. And they borrow not in Turkish lira. That's why they don't care if the interest rates are very high. They actually want the interest rates to be very high. They borrow in euros or in dollars, in foreign currencies. So this is transnational, and this is the strongest group in Turkey, the strongest. And many companies, as you said, they import intermediate products, they assemble it in Turkey, and they export it again in a transnational way. They have offices, I've read, everywhere, in Asia, in London, in Berlin, in New York, and everywhere in the world. And they make a lot of consortia with other companies, foreign capital as well. Now, this is has a dominant position in Turkey. Now, Musiad is mostly, not exclusively, dominated by SMEs.
Yeah.
Right? And these are those who borrow in Turkish liras. They was mostly supported by Erdogan, and so on and so forth.
That's why,
that's
why interest rates directly affect them.
Yeah, that's why interest rates directly affect them. And what is interesting here is how Erdogan managed to recompose both of these big blocks and make, change the Turkish state.
I mean, from the very start, he worked with his party organization around these groups and the workers of these groups. So he didn't build this huge organization from one day to another. From the start, he was working, and as he had more and more opportunities when the economy started expanding in the first 10 years, he used this situation to support this group. And therefore, for many people, millions of people in Turkey, this was the actual source they feel proud of, and they feel they are supported, they can rely on. People are finding jobs through these networks. And so everything was happening around it. It is, I think, to me, that is the key reason why Erdogan still won the elections.
Yeah.
Despite everything.
And quite a few of them are family companies or bigger family companies where workers are not organized. They have more patriarchal relation to the boss, so they feel more loyalty to the
Yes.
boss than, let's say, the worker of Koch factory, for example. Everybody is organized, they have their unions and so on. These people are mostly more religiously, nationalistically, and patriarchally loyal to the boss.
And quite often, boss also work with them every single day, just like one of them.
But the question remains:
Yeah.
what are we going to do?
Yeah, that is what I
What
was
is to
saying.
be done?
Well, as I said at that stage, I mean, there is no shortcut. There is no easy solution. You have to go to those places, you have to go to those people and establish alternative organizations, alternative solutions to their day-to-day problems. As we, in our youth, we were doing this. And we were doing this just before the military coup. Every single trade union, every single even local organizations were controlled by us in Turkey. You know, this is why they couldn't introduce neoliberal measures, because everybody was up. But then when the military coup came, they hit the left, they hit the socialists, and they kept them under heavy pressure for a long time. And then when the situation started to open a little bit, the new left or the new left-wing groups, they adapted themselves to those conditions, and therefore that generational experience wasn't passed to the new generations. When I talk about these things, saying that in late 1970s we were doing this, people think, oh really? People think we are talking about a completely different world. I was saying that when I was living in a shanty town, and me and my wife, even though I was married, we used to see each other once a month because she was in another part of the city on a different shanty town. And they were looking, but why? Why are you doing this? Because now today's socialists so far, they are living in the luxurious part of Istanbul or Ankara or Izmir, and they have their professional jobs, and they think just by talking or by maybe writing they can achieve some change. But I'm afraid there's no other way. You have to go back to those conditions and take the risk and live with those people if you want them to understand.
Thank you so much for this illuminating
No, thank you.
It's amazing, and we'll look forward for the article now. Thanks for coming along. Thank you for the technical support and you for organizing this. Again,
Thank you.